The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, the Red-Headed League. It was a crisp autumn day when I decided to call upon my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, at our lodgings at 221 B. Baker Street. I found him not alone, but deep in conversation with a portly, red-faced gentleman whose fiery red hair was so vibrant it seemed to light up the room. Holmes, with his usual keen-eyed intensity, gestured for me to enter. "Ah, Watson, you arrive at a most opportune moment. Here is a gentleman, Mr. Jabez Wilson, with a story so singular, so utterly bizarre, it promises to be a most interesting puzzle." Mr. Wilson, looking thoroughly bewildered, fumbled in his coat pocket and pulled out a creased and folded newspaper. "It all started with this advertisement right here," he said, his voice trembling with a mix of confusion and frustration. "I would have paid it no mind, you see, but my assistant, a clever young man named Vincent Spaulding, was most insistent. He brought it to my attention, saying it was the chance of a lifetime, a fortune practically handed to me on a silver platter." "The advertisement," Mr. Wilson explained, pointing a thick finger at a small column in the paper, "was for an organization called the Red-Headed League. It was a most peculiar notice, offering a handsome salary of £4 a week, a small fortune, for a man with hair of a certain shade of red. The duties were described as being, quote, purely nominal, meaning I'd have to do very little. Spaulding was so enthusiastic, he wouldn't let the matter drop. He insisted I apply, saying my hair was the perfect shade. When I arrived at the address given in the paper," Mr. Wilson continued, his eyes wide at the memory, "the street was an absolute river of red hair. There were men of every shape and size, but all of them had hair ranging from carrot orange to deep auburn. I had never seen so many red-headed men in one place. It was a sea of ginger. I felt my chances were slim and almost gave up, but Spaulding, who had accompanied me, practically pushed me through the crowd and into the office." Inside, a small, sharp-featured man with hair even more fiery than my own sat behind a desk. He introduced himself as Mr. Duncan Ross. The interview was surprisingly brief. He didn't ask about my skills or my past. He simply took a good, long look at my hair. Then he gave it a sharp tug to make sure it was real. To my astonishment, he announced that I was the perfect candidate for the vacancy. I was hired on the spot, just like that. My job was the strangest I have ever had, Mr. Holmes. I was to report to the office every day from 10 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon. My sole task was to sit at a long table and copy out the Encyclopedia Britannica, starting with the letter A. I was given a pen, ink, and a stack of ledgers. The only rule was that I was not to leave the room for any reason during those 4 hours. It was peculiar, but it was the easiest money I ever earned. For 8 weeks, this strange routine continued without a single change. I copied page after page, filling ledger after ledger with facts about abbots, archery, and Abyssinia. My hand grew tired, but my pockets grew heavy. I rarely saw Mr. Duncan Ross, except for a brief moment each day when he would pop his head in to make sure I was working. I was perfectly content with this bizarre but profitable arrangement. Then, this morning, everything vanished. I went to the office at the usual time, expecting to continue my work on the letter B. But the office was locked. A small, square card was tacked to the door. In neat handwriting, it read, "The Red-Headed League is dissolved. October 9th, 1890. Just like that. No warning, no explanation. The League, my salary, my easy job, all gone." Back in our sitting room, Holmes leaned forward, his gray eyes shining with interest. "This is a most remarkable case, Mr. Wilson. A 3-pipe problem, I believe. Now, tell me everything you can about this assistant of yours, this Vincent Spaulding." Mr. Wilson described him as a clever and hard-working young man, so eager to learn the pawnbroker's business that he had agreed to work for half the usual wages. He also mentioned, as an afterthought, that Spaulding was an avid photographer and spent a great deal of time in the cellar, which he had converted into a darkroom. After our client had departed, Holmes sprang from his chair with a newfound energy. "Come, Watson. The game is afoot. We traveled to Saxe-Coburg Square, the location of Mr. Wilson's pawnshop. Once there, Holmes did a most peculiar thing. He walked up and down the street, not looking at the shop, but at the pavement, which he tapped vigorously with his walking stick. He then stood back and stared intently at the buildings on either side of the shop, his brow furrowed in concentration. I hadn't the faintest idea what he was looking for. Holmes then walked up to the pawnshop door and knocked. It was opened by a bright, clean-shaven young man, the assistant, Vincent Spaulding. Holmes, pretending to be a lost tourist, asked for directions to the Strand. As Spaulding gave the directions, I knew Holmes was really observing the man from head to toe. I followed my friend's gaze and saw him glance down pointedly at the knees of Spaulding's trousers. They were stained with dirt and wrinkled, as if he had been kneeling for a long time. As we walked away, Holmes was practically buzzing with excitement. "Did you see his trousers, Watson? It's even more serious than I expected. And now, we must act swiftly," he said, his eyes gleaming. "A major crime is about to be committed, one of the boldest attempts in years. I will need your help. Meet me at Baker Street tonight at 10 o'clock, and be sure to bring your service revolver. It may be a dangerous evening." That night, a cab delivered us to a quiet street where two other men were waiting. One was Peter Jones, a determined, if somewhat unimaginative, police inspector from Scotland Yard. The other was a tall, grim-faced man in a top hat named Mr. Merriweather. "Gentlemen," Holmes announced in a low voice, "tonight we are going to the City and Suburban Bank. We have an appointment with a notorious criminal." Mr. Merriweather, who turned out to be a director of the bank, led us through heavy iron gates and down a winding stone staircase into the cold, dark vault. The air was damp and smelled of earth. "The bank received a shipment of French gold," he whispered, his voice shaking as he pointed to several large wooden crates. "We are sitting on 30,000 gold Napoleons. I pray you are right about this, Mr. Holmes, for the bank's reputation is at stake." Holmes instructed Mr. Merriweather to extinguish the lantern, plunging us into absolute, pitch-black darkness. The silence was profound, broken only by the sound of our own breathing. It was a long, tense wait, and my nerves were stretched to their breaking point. I could hear the frantic beating of my own heart in the silence. Holmes, however, was as still and calm as a statue, a silent predator waiting for his prey. After what felt like an eternity, a faint glint of light appeared through the cracks in the stone floor. It grew brighter, and then, with a quiet, grating sound that seemed deafening in the silence, one of the large paving stones began to lift. A white, well-manicured hand appeared in the opening, followed by another, as someone pushed the heavy stone aside. A moment later, the boyish face of Vincent Spaulding, the pawnbroker's assistant, emerged from the hole in the floor. He hoisted himself up and then helped another man, a man with fiery red hair, to climb out. It was Duncan Ross, the manager of the Red-Headed League. Spaulding looked around the vault, a triumphant smirk on his face, clearly believing their plan had succeeded. "It's no use, John Clay," said Holmes, suddenly striking a match and lighting the lantern. He stepped forward into the circle of light. "You are caught." The assistant, whose real name was John Clay, spun around, his face a mask of shock and fury. His partner scrambled back toward the tunnel, but Inspector Jones was too quick for him. I rushed forward with my revolver as Jones seized the infamous criminal before he could even draw his weapon. Back in the familiar comfort of our Baker Street sitting room, Holmes lit his pipe and began to explain. It was quite simple, really, Watson. The ridiculous story of the Red-Headed League was simply a clever trick. The criminals needed to get the pawnbroker, Mr. Wilson, out of his shop for a few hours every day so they would have uninterrupted time for their real work. The assistant, the notorious John Clay, was digging a tunnel from the pawnshop cellar to the bank vault next door. Tapping the pavement told me the cellar extended in that direction. His story about being a photographer explained his time in the cellar, and the dirty, wrinkled knees on his trousers were the final clue that confirmed he had been digging. The whole scheme was designed to keep Mr. Wilson occupied while they burrowed their way to a fortune. It was elementary, my dear Watson. Quite elementary,